Good morning. Welcome to PlaceTech Talks Industrial and Logistics. My name is Dan Hughes from Alpha Property Insight, which helps property companies navigate data and digital transformation. And a huge thank you to our sponsor for this session, Malcolm. It's hard to ignore the backdrop of COVID to the discussion today. And over the last 18 months or so, the property market has, if not been completely reshaped, certainly seen a rapid acceleration in the change that was already underway and of new ways of doing things. And this has affected all sectors, but none more so than industrial and logistics. Whether growing demand for space to serve online shopping, a new way of considering where manufacturing should take place, or the evolution of warehouses from traditional drafty sheds and advanced buildings in the market, change is happening all across the sector. And aside from COVID, it's also impossible to ignore COP26 and the recent focus on the environment. ESG has rapidly risen up the agenda, and this is an area where industrial buildings and supply chains face many of the largest challenges. In the coming years and decades, we're also going to see the increased traction of some of the more science fiction types of technology. 3D printing, autonomous cars, drones, advanced robotics will all reshape where space is needed and how it performs in the industrial market. Today, we have two fantastic panels to discuss all of this and more, with a 10-minute networking break in between. Please do submit your questions as we go through. I'll do my best to introduce them into the conversation. So if I could ask the panelists to join me on the virtual stage, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Bird from Cromwell Property Group, Tim Hurdis from Harworth, Phil Davis from Magway, and Kevin Moffat from Saville. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for joining. Phil, maybe I could start with you. Good morning. Could you just introduce yourself and say a little bit about your company?
Yeah, I'm Phil Davis. I'm co-founder of Magway. We're a solution for delivering goods sustainably and efficiently. So, with Black Friday upon us, all of the billions and billions of parcels that are being loaded onto vehicles and driven to our homes, we take those goods off the vehicles and the vehicles off the road and deliver them sustainably and efficiently through pipelines.
Fantastic, thank you. Matthew, good morning. Same question to you.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Bird. I'm head of UK for Cromwell. We're a fund manager, investment manager with a particular focus on local expertise through our network of offices across the whole of Europe and also Australia and Asia, and also development expertise as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for the welcome. Yeah, Tim Hurdis, based in the Birmingham office of Harworth. Harworth is a UK-based PLC, value about £570 million, around 8 employees, based in Rotherham, with offices also in Manchester and where I'm sat today here in Birmingham. We have two main areas of activities: land remediation for sale to house builders of service plots, together with the direct development of industrial and logistics space. Our current land bank, we have about consent for around 26 million square feet of space, mainly in the north of the country. In terms of major schemes, logistics north by Bolton, about 4 million square and 250 acres, around half of which has been built to date. And close to home here in the Midlands, we've just acquired a site at Rothwell, 107 acres. We take about 1.5 million square feet of space. And we're currently delivering a 334,000 square feet mid-box scheme at Barden in Colville, Leicestershire.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Sounds very busy. Kevin, good morning. Same to you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Dan, for inviting me today. So I'm Kevin Moffat. I head up industrial and logistics research for Savills across the UK and Europe. I have been talking, writing, analysing warehousing now for about 15 years. 15 years ago, nobody wanted to speak to me. And now, I get invited to all sorts of events to talk about what's going on in the market. We at Savills have a team of people across Europe advising landlords, developers and occupiers on their logistics, real estate strategies, and data is the backbone of what we do. So I have myriads of data that I analyze that allows us to help our clients make the right investment decisions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, Kevin, if I can stick with you for a minute, it is impossible, as I said in the introduction, to avoid the backdrop of the last 18 months or 2 years or so. What changes have you seen in the industrial and logistics market at a high level over that period?
Well, the biggest observation I have is how macro events that are out of everybody's control really are impacting the market. So by that I mean issues like the availability of HGV drivers, our new trading arrangements with the EU, the kind of the bullwhip effect we're seeing in global supply chains at the moment. The fact that containers are misplaced all over the world. Speaking to a lot of supply chain consultants that we at Savills work with, it seems to me that the occupiers of warehouse space are saying, well, we can't control what's going on globally. The one thing we can control is how much inventory we're holding and where we're holding it. And that's having a direct impact on the requirements for warehouse space. So we at Savills, one of the data sets that I have access to is every single requirement for warehouse space that comes from an occupier. And if you look at this time series, with every single month that's passed since March 2020, the level of requirements that we have recorded has increased every single month. That's had a knock-on impact into actual take-up. So for 2 years now in a row, we're going to see over 50 million square feet transacted in the UK. The same is broadly true across continental Europe, record levels of take-up. And at the same time, we've seen vacancy rates plummet. And the market has reacted to that. We are seeing a significant amount of speculative development. But there are issues in the construction supply chain. We're struggling to get hold of steel. We're struggling to get hold of concrete. And if you think about, the two key materials needed for a new warehouse, that's a big problem. So what that means is that we're in a prolonged period now where the supply of warehousing is going to be constrained. The demand is above normal, way above normal, and that's going to put upward pressure on rents and land values.
Okay. So Matthew, maybe I can come to you. Are you seeing the same thing? So huge increase in demand, but some real problems with supply.
We absolutely are. I mean, I think building on what Kevin said there, obviously COVID, but the term impact has been just the e-commerce growth that's come through and trebled in recent years. So as part of that, everyone has had to reshape their global supply chains. And again, touching what Kevin said there, you've had blocked canals, you've had closed ports, things that are outside of our control. So supply chains are changing, and there has been a drive rather than having just in time, which obviously is key and important, but just in case. And I think that is also just a driver for demand on the occupational side as well. So we have seen across our portfolio, not only here in the UK, but across Europe, we have continued to see rental growth and strong rental growth in many of those markets. And on an investment side, because of the fundamentals, because of the ongoing anticipation of rental growth coming through and strong demand, investment values have continued to harden as new entrants have seen the opportunity within the sectors, and the diverse parts of that sector have driven returns.
That's great. And Tim, picking on from what Matthew and Kevin also said in the development side of things, are you seeing some of the challenges with the concrete and the steel and labour and so on? Is that a problem that you're encountering as well?
Absolutely. I think what it brings into focus is having the right type of contractor, well organised, because the lead-in period for a number of materials is so great. You know, docks and those, and dock doors, sort of 30 to 40 weeks lead-in time. So you've almost got to be ordering those before you've started the groundworks, which is sort of slightly counterintuitive. So you really do need to have a contracting and professional team able to react to that. Allied to that, whilst the supply of materials, I think, may ease off over the course of the next 6, 12 months. Indeed, there has been some signs of that. Some of the cladding is becoming more available. The problem you then have, you don't necessarily have the labour force to actually fix the cladding, to actually erect the steel. And that, again, is creating a major issue. Now, how short term is it? Who knows? But I think it's certainly a very much real and present risk to the delivery of schemes and the programme implications therein, let alone the cost side of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like unprecedented growth in demand from Matthew. Your point, I think, was fantastic about needing the just in time, but also the just in case. So that do in demand. But if we have all these challenges with supply, what are we going to see happening over the coming year or two? Is that going to continue, do we think, or how do we get over that? What needs to happen to change that?
Well, I think on that point, it's easy to moan, say about the cost going up and all the rest of it. But the scheme we're involved in at Barden, we're seeing a sort of circuit, thick end of 10%, rent inflation for a scheme nearby that was completed about 12 months ago, and we're talking to occupiers, rents were somewhere in the order 10% higher. Now, and the point also about yields compressing even further. So whilst we are seeing cost increases, equally we're seeing value enhancement as well. So it's not all negative stuff. But again, I think it also comes down to correctly specifying at the moment, not over specifying. And I know we'll probably touch on it in a bit, but energy efficiency, having buildings which do have a good energy rating and that type of thing, it's becoming, certainly chatting to some of the European companies, or European-based companies, that is certainly very much on their agenda.
Yeah, that's great. And Matthew, are you seeing the same thing, that costs are going up, but actually the values and the rents are going up as well? So that's just a sort of an inexplicable link that is going to remain, or is it a problem that needs to be overcome?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, kind of one of the things we're looking at when we're always buying kind of existing assets is just replacement cost. It's one of those prudent studies you look at, and those numbers are only going up, unsurprisingly, as you look through. So you do see that. But we are seeing the values and the returns and the rewards from starting schemes has paid off handsomely for many investors and developers. And we do anticipate that to come and continue. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing for a number of schemes is initial yields, if we're looking to a scheme that's recently completed, is that the yield will look keener than it has before. That's partly the market and demand, but partly reflecting that it will be reversionary. If it was a build to suit, or if it was let at the beginning of a construction period, often you'll find that rents have moved on within that particular scheme. And as Tim touched upon there, other surrounding landlords and developers then pushing the boundaries which are being met. I mean, one of the interesting things that is being debated at the moment is do developers actually have a mechanism in the lease so that there is a first rent review on practical of the asset, which is a way maybe of picking up some of that. So not only obviously do you get to secure your tenant, and from a tenant's point of view, they obviously get to secure the unit, which is the most important thing for them, because there is a lack of opportunity for them to find available and suitable space. But this is a possible consideration or mechanism that could come into play.
Okay, that's fantastic. Phil, maybe I could come to you. So we've heard definite growth in demand. Obviously, there's huge amounts of parcels and deliveries and logistics that's required. You mentioned Black Friday earlier. From what I've seen this year, it seems to be Black November or Black Autumn. It seems to be going on for a long time. But how can technology and new ways of doing things get over this growing demand for the logistics? But also, we've heard about some of the headwinds in terms of availability of drivers or whatever it might be. What are your views on that?
Yeah, so I think we've seen a perfect storm, which has basically highlighted the vulnerability of supply chain. And on top of that, the environment has moved rapidly to the top of everyone's agenda in terms of sustainability. And we've seen within these warehouses, a great deal of automation, some phenomenal technology within the heart of the warehouses. So you only need to go into an Amazon or a Ricardo warehouse where automated grids can pick 50 items in less than 5 minutes. And we've seen a lot of development again within cities around introducing new modes of transport, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and drones in those cities. And what we do as an organization is we connect those two parts of the value chain. So we extend the automation beyond the warehouse, so connecting warehouses, but also bringing those goods close to the final destination when we hand over to autonomous vehicles, etc., for that final mile. And we can also enhance the data feed between the warehouses and between the warehouse and the city, which basically enables you to act more holistically, more sustainably, and also more efficiently. And I think one of the other elements in terms of innovation for warehousing is around this idea of building vertically and considering the warehouse more on a volumetric basis, so getting more from that space with the use of technology.
Okay, that's great. So very much about taking the inside automation and supply chain and extending it beyond the building.
Yeah, I mean, at the edges of these buildings, it's still extremely manual. So you have literally grids, mostly 3 football fields across, 3 stories wide, robots running across the top. So very, very efficient at the heart of these warehouses. On the edges, people are still lugging the crates onto cages, rolling the cages onto vehicles. The vehicles are congesting the road, polluting the environment, etc., etc., etc. And what we want to do is extend that automation beyond those 4 walls and the efficiency, so we can enhance the efficiency through the flow of data. Our solution has been described as the physical internet. We're moving packets of goods as opposed to packets of data, but we're also harvesting a great deal of data which we can use and share to enhance that whole supply chain.
Okay, that's great. We'll certainly come back to data because I think that's really important. It's come up a few times. Matthew, before we do that, to just pick on Phil's comments there about the supply chain and connecting up, and about having the inside of a building automated, but then very manual to get outside of that. Is that something that you see changing over time, and does that change the investment decisions that you make?
Yeah, I think what we're increasingly seeing is just robotics and automation. So it's absolutely imperative that sites and investments and buildings that are purchased or developed have that ability for power and for connectivity. I think anything that is lacking of some of those fundamentals, there's the potential, and we'll see it, and we'll talk about it no doubt later about ESG, but we're seeing a green premium as we move towards kind of a brown impact, and I'm sure that the same will be true also for buildings that don't have the ability to be as connected as Phil has alluded to there. And I think a lot of this for buildings that aren't necessarily set up to do that, there will be technological developments, and companies such as Phil's will be at the forefront of it, bringing those solutions forward.
That's great. Tim, same question to you. Clearly, you're building and developing properties which are for automation within. How do you go about looking at the changing over time, the changing automation from out and going from that very manual process to more automated? Does that affect the design at all?
Jez, you obviously need good floor loading. You always do the basic stuff. So don't try and save a bit of money on the floor loading. Make sure you've got adequate floor loadings, maybe, similar floor loadings across the board. If it's sort of 20,000 square foot, a few 100,000 square foot, still have the right floor loadings there. But one thing we have seen is the requirement for electricity. And I think that anywhere that is, has a limited supply, or maybe enough supply that we've traditionally had for building, we're certainly finding a number of occupiers, if not all occupiers we're talking to, want more than traditionally we would expect. And that's not just for EV charging point, it is for the automation point. It is for that side of it. And maybe taking over from when gas is, either, potentially phased out. If they do want to start heating these warehouses, it will be more electricity based rather than gas. So I think the big, from our point of view, we're finding is get as much electricity as you can secured early doors, and then we'll almost double it again to make sure you've got a bit of resilience in there, because I think more electricity will be required than less.
Okay, that's great. And Kevin, and then probably to follow on from that, I want to talk about data. What data is available that you're using in the market? Some of which you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. As I said, I've been kind of talking and writing about warehousing for 15 or so years now, and I think the point that Phil made about the automation on the outside of the warehouse has really gathered steam in the last, I'd say, 4 years, 5 years. I went over to Wembley with Phil to see their solution probably around 2.5 years ago now, and it's really exciting in terms of how this may develop. And I think the property industry has some questions to answer. I'll give you an example. So just this month in November, I've had 3 emails and subsequent phone calls about the prospect of truck platooning. And this concept is, that you would have a vehicle at the front of a convoy, and the rest of the HGVs would be following in a platoon, effectively autonomously and automatically. Now, on the face of it, that sounds great, because you're eliminating the need for a driver. It's very efficient and so on. But if we just think about the real estate impacts of that, it probably can't be the case that a convoy of 100 vehicles could go from the port to various different logistics parks. There probably needs to be an area where the trucks can deplatoon and then be shuttled to their final destination. And I'd argue that the case is possibly true for the solution that Phil is proposing as well. That actually you're going to have these hub points where there may be automation in the wider supply chain, and so you still need somewhere for this kind of terminal almost. And whether that's a truck platoon or whether it's an underground tunnel or whatever it may be. I've seen a question come in on rail, which I'll just address whilst I can, because rail is the same thing really. You need a place where the rail can get from A to B, and historically rail needs to be reasonably long distances to make it efficient and very high container volumes. And the solution from Phil and Magway would certainly alleviate some of that problem, because you're not talking about the scale. But all of these automation solutions ultimately need a real estate solution as well. And in the same way that you have local authorities mandating connections to rail freight for new schemes, I think in the future, planning authorities will also be mandating that space is given over to whatever the automation solution is, whether it's a network of underground tunnels or an area for trucks to platoon and replatoon, whatever it might be. But I think developers need to be thinking about this for schemes that are due in, the next 10 years, I'd say. Actually, we might need to give over 10 acres of land for some sort of automation terminal. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting development in the medium term.
Really interesting. Tim, maybe I could come to you on that point about over land to these sort of termination points, but also Kevin's points, I think, which has also come up in the question in the from. It seems to be suggesting about the impact of the government on whether it's the rail or the roads infrastructure. How account that are the government and the local authorities taking enough and proactive enough?
Rail's been talked about for many years, hasn't it? And I think there is going to definitely be a role for that. But again, I think certainly a couple of experiences we've had, connecting into the main line, there is limited capacity on the rail network at the moment. And actually to create a new connection into the rail network, the capital cost is very significant. We've certainly got one site at the moment, which is about 80 acres of hard standing on a north and south rail connection. And we're getting a lot of interest from intermodal transport operators for that location. Road connectivity isn't fantastic, but it's that rail connectivity. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is limited, I think, capacity on the rail network at the moment without major capital investment. Now, the question then, does that come from Network Rail? Where does it come from central government? Where does that actually sit? And I think that's probably and also the time scale for it to be delivered. And again, interesting about the lorries and that type of thing. Again, larger yards for buildings obviously required to allow the lorry to be stored there. But is the road network capable of taking such, or for want of a better term, road trains type of situations? And then again, if we are setting aside 10, 20 acres for storage, will that give the same sort of returns? And again, how is that going to be factored into any appraisal? So yes, it's very laudable, and I agree that's the direction of travel, but is it actually achievable?
Matthew, maybe I can come to you next with I suppose the same question, but possibly another add-on question as well, which is about data. And we've heard about sustainability, we've heard about connectivity, we've heard about electricity supply, the infrastructure around roads and rail to get to a building. These are all things that feed into your decisions that you're making. How do you go about getting access into that data beyond the probably the more traditional supply and demand and rent side of things, which is of course really important, but how do you get the new data sets that are coming along about these other factors?
Yeah, thank you. And this is increasingly kind of relevant and important. You're right, most of the focus historically across our industry has been on rental evidence, it's been on land values, it's been on build costs, so on and so forth, and demand. But increasingly, with ESG at the forefront and the requirements from our occupiers, we will have to collect more data, and I think also the way of storing it. And I think that's something that is going to absolutely come to the fore, and it is at the forefront of many businesses already. So what we're having we haven't yet seen across the particulars that we've looked at or the opportunities we've looked at, we haven't yet seen anyone stating what their carbon footprint or a carbon rating for a building is. We have seen, obviously, EPCs, we have seen BREEAMs, we've seen LEED, we've seen those kind of metrics, but we haven't yet seen someone coming up with a fundamental all rating. And I think you obviously have already got energy consumption. We use various different software and apps for collating energy consumption. So DeepKey is one example of a service that we use and subscribe to over in France and further afield as well. And that got to be able in the first place to map your buildings. You've got to know where your meters are so that you can calculate it. But increasingly, yeah, if you can't count it, find that you are further back in the information chain, and with so many regulations coming through, which are plaudable and absolutely the right direction we're going in, you've got to know how to get that data in the first place. And I think one of the things we look forward to as an industry is hopefully continued collaboration, so that we can actually come up with common themes.
And just sticking with you, Matthew, measuring the data is clearly important, and one that you've cited there, which is a very good example. Excuse me. But to benchmark, how do you share across the sector to get good information on that?
I think that's one thing lots of people are still traveling on. I think that we haven't yet found the ultimate solution, and this is such a key component, so that to make sure that you're acquiring, you're owning, you're developing the right real estate that isn't going to be impacted negatively in the future, and it's got long-term sustainable credentials. Case of beginning to map and then making sure it's all integrated. So you're absolutely right. It's the one thing you touched on there, making sure that any data sources or points that you collect, and there are a lot of different providers of this, that there is connectivity and the ability for that information to be shared. Now, sorry, apologies. Carry on. Yeah. So it's to be shared. Yeah. And I think that is. That's one thing we're looking at. It's one thing others are looking at as well.
That's great, Kevin, and you'll have to forgive my choking on my strong glass of water this morning. But Kevin, from a data sharing point of view across the market, clearly organisations such as Savills have your own proprietary data, and you've got great data sets. But from a market level, how do we better data sharing? How do we go about better benchmarking to understand all of these different factors that we're talking about?
I think in the UK we are blessed with quite transparent markets. The UK market is probably more mature than some of our European markets. If we move into continental Europe, the markets, the logistics markets are less mature, particularly on the capital markets side, and in some cases, the logistics market as we know it in the UK has really only evolved in the last 5 or 10 years, and the situation that you have in certain European markets is much more of a brokerage mentality rather than a advisory mentality. So that means that a lot of the data that we would traditionally come to expect in markets like the UK and the US is actually not available. I think one of the benefits of the increased flow of money into the logistics market, particularly on the capital markets side, is actually going to improve transparency because more data points will become available. It will be, in reality, the responsibility of all of the developers and investors in the market to help improve the transparency of data in those markets. So it's not a quick fix. It's not an easy solution, but I think better data ultimately improves the liquidity of the market. So I'm working with all of our clients and all of our teams across Europe to try and improve that, but ultimately I think it will be my career's work to have as good data sets in continental Europe that we have come to expect in the UK.
That's great. Tim, same question to you. And I think Kevin was suggesting that this is going to be about investors and developers coming together to share data, which is in principle a very good idea, but obviously very difficult when it's a very fragmented market. So What are your views on the market's view to data at the moment and the use of data? And also, how do we get better quality?
Well, I suppose from the investment point of view, we had IPD and now MSCI have actually been collating data for quite a few years now. So I think from the investment point of view, that is probably leading the way there. That's become almost accepted from being a relatively slow burner. I think, as Kevin rightly says, I think there's fairly good transparency now, and indeed, performance of number of funds are, there's the benchmark there. They're assessed against. So I think that's coming through. I suppose like anything, there's so much data now that's being produced. How can it be analysed? How can it actually be made useful data type of thing? But I think we are going to get more transparency. I think it has to be a good thing. And where the market is going, where the trends are going, where the values, costs are going as well. And also, what are the right investment decisions to make, be it in the materials that you use or the building methodology, building construction way of doing it. So I think it will take, a few secret squirrels have to be culled, but I think as a principle, it's the right way for the industry as part of its maturity.
And who should be driving that? Because obviously individual companies can't really drive that. You mentioned IPD or MSCI as they are now. There need to be an independent organisation that collects that data. So data, for example, we spoke about energy use within buildings. Does it need to be an independent organisation that collects that?
I think it has. I think yes, because to give people confidence that the data can be put into it on an anonymous basis and not utilised on a specific site-by-site basis, but gives greater clarity to the performance of the market as a whole. Again, just chuck this in. We're talking about. No doubt we'll touch on ESG. Do you think it becomes part of reporting standards that would be expected by auditors or the stock market? There has to be greater data clarity, greater data collection as part of the overall reporting structure from a financial basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to come to you, Phil, in a minute, just to pick up on some of your points earlier about data. But just before I do, Matthew, I think you're involved with the IPF. So just from an industry body and representative body, what role do you think bodies such as the IPF have in this wider data collection and standardization and reporting that Tim was just talking about?
I think a lot of it is research, and then it's education. So the two main drivers, as well as networking and collaboration and sharing, is research and education. And so I think it's absolutely at the forefront of those industry bodies to drive that knowledge, share that information, so we can all achieve the common goals that we have. And I think, touching one other thing that was talked about there, I think if you look at some of the other countries as well that have had government targets about energy consumption and energy usage installed recently. So if you look at France, for example, where energy consumption's got to decrease by 40% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 60% by 2050, following the Paris Agreement. What that means is those are benchmarks that companies have got to hit. And in order to do that, that information will be supplied. And I think one of the other things that is talked about and is coming, but it hasn't yet been set, and how different countries approach it is going to be very different, but it's a taxonomy as well. So we know that's coming through, but we don't know yet how it's going to be calculated. We don't know on what elements it's going to be calculated. Is it based on income? Is it on energy uses? Is it on value? All of these things I think are yet unknown. Drafts are being talked about and circulated. However, I think once that is set, then we will get greater knowledge, because we will get to see how different companies and investors are tackling some of these things. So one of the things that we are considering ourselves as a business is in different geographies on a European basis here, what are going to be the different ways to introduce reduction in, say, energy consumption, or which materials do you use? So what you do in the Nordics will be very different maybe from what you do in southern Spain or Italy, for example, and that will come down to the energy that's required, the materials that you use, and I think in time, we will build up that knowledge and we can use that to decide and have almost a toolkit that we can decide which of those are going to be the most effective for us going forward.
That's great. And Phil, maybe I can come data point of view. The internet itself is driven by data, and I think you just the physical internet, which I thought was a nice analogy. You're collecting huge amounts of data. What and how can you provide that to investors, developers, and the market to make better decisions?
So there is currently a great deal of data within the warehouse, and there's a lot of data within the city, and we want to basically extend that and link the two. So the system that you see behind me, and we run that continuously. Every every kilometer we harvest 90 megabits of data. So currently you load goods onto a vehicle and it's kind of lost into the ether. We can provide the entire audit trail of those goods. If you talk about farm to fork, but also from the warehouse and from the port, all the way to the customer. And we can also enhance services. So customers, if they're delayed in their, and again, sorry, we go direct from the warehouse to consolidation centers on the edges of town. So we're calling them nodes. And customers can have the goods delivered from those nodes, or they can, or they can collect them from those nodes. If they want to redirect the deliveries, and they're able to do that. I think just picking up on another point that was raised in terms of standardization. So we were at COP26 for the duration. One common theme was the need for standards, for common standards. One organization say their net zero means something totally different to another organization saying net zero. So one of the outcomes coming out from COP26 was an element of standardization around carbon offsets and the quality of carbon offsets. I think another observation was the level of engagement at senior level within commercial organizations, and those organizations are pushing back on their entire supply chain. So it's like, and they want to understand category 3 emissions. How sustainable are their logistics companies? How sustainable are the buildings that they're occupying? That was something which was also coming through. So the use of data has a significant role to play in terms of enhancing the efficiency of the movement of goods. Currently, there's a massive amount of empty space that's moved around the countries, and the middle mile, the middle bit of that journey is the hardest and most difficult to do sustainably. The electric vehicle, electric heavy goods vehicles, a third of the payload, a third of the vehicle is made up of battery. So it's how do you do it sustainably and efficiently and harness the technology that exists to make that whole entire ecosystem more sustainable and efficient.
That's great. So I was actually out in Paris for COP21 talking about the standardization of data to get these things done. So it's really good that it's still being talked about. There seems to be unanimous agreement that it's really important, better standardization and sharing. Why are we not making more progress as a sector, or are we making more progress? And if we're not, how do we go about working together? Because whilst an enormous sector, we're also very fragmented. We have lots of different moving parts within it. So how do you think, Phil, maybe if I stay with you, how do we take this forward to actually make change rather than talk about the need for it?
Agreed. So going to Greta Thunberg and her blah, blah, blah. There is an amazing amount of goodwill. There's unbelievable. From heads of industry, just walking around Glasgow, conversations on buses and in restaurants, with the activists and whatever else. And there is, and there will always be early adopters, but more and more people are coming to the table, and it is now at the top of their agenda. So we, as an illustration, we are working on an initiative for a zero emission freight zone in West London. It's a 16-kilometre route from Northolt all the way to the River Thames. And around the table, we have major organizations from retail, from logistics, from property, warehousing, development, and parcel moving, who are looking at their own businesses to understand what the implications are for them and how they can benefit from connecting their warehouses and moving goods more efficiently, but also in the broader context of what does the future hold? How do they look to the next 5, 10, 20 years and work together to achieve the goal of a more sustainable supply chain? And organizations that ordinarily wouldn't sit around the table or be in the room together are talking about sharing infrastructure, sharing warehousing, and other elements, and considering, and it also means they can think more holistically about where they put their warehouses and their facilities. So the size of the challenge means that, and in the backdrop of Brexit and COVID and all of these other things, and the fact that we're killing our planet, or we need to save our planet, putting it on turning it on its head, they are really pushing the boat and pushing the ambition.
I mean, Dan, just to interject, and a lot of the data focus, rightly so, is on net zero and ESG. But if I just bring this back to real estate for a minute, how nobody knows how many warehouses there are in Germany or Italy or various other countries in Europe. So nobody knows how many there are. Nobody knows where they are, because there's no data set that actually tracks this. We've got half decent data in the UK, well, actually very decent data in the UK from the Ordnance Survey, people like CoStar, and other secondary providers. But to get an accurate total stock figure for many countries in Europe is technically impossible. Some of the agencies and brokers across Europe, do a reasonable job of it, but ultimately, there is no public body that actually knows, what real estate is in existence. And we've done some work within Savills, combining data sets from the land registry, from the Ordnance Survey, from the valuation office, but that is really difficult because, again, take the valuation office data in the UK. Some of it is in a standardized format for England and Wales, but if you want to pull in Scottish data, it's in a different format. It's not available. It's so just fundamental questions like that actually can't be answered. Which if it sounds like a very simple question. How much warehousing is there and where is it? No one knows. It's as simple as that.
So realistically, if we're talking about needing to understand the energy performance of all the buildings and the connectivity and the logistics and all of those different things, which are really going to help investors and occupiers to drive forward things, if we can't identify how many buildings there are that are industrial in a country, realistically, how are we going to get to that next stage, Kevin?
Well, somebody can commission me to do it. I'd like that. But as I said, that would take me and my team our entire careers to do. So joking apart, it needs to be, at a government level. It needs to be the equivalent organizations of, the land registry, of the Ordnance Survey. These data sets need to be public. They need to be open source. They need to be digitized. they need to be made available for people to play with and manipulate and interrogate. And that needs to be legislation led. Really, it's not a job, I think, that can be easily done by a commercial enterprise, because our goals are slightly different, in terms of generating fee income and so on. So I think really it needs to be led by the public sector.
Yeah. Okay, Matthew, I'm conscious of time, but just very quickly, two very quick questions for you. One is, how much does the transparency of data, I mean, we've had a pretty good example from Kevin there, how much does it inform your investment decisions and where you would go? But also, if it becomes mandated on us, so for example, we all of a sudden have to report about, at a sector level, all of the sustainability of our buildings, and we've, I think, spoken about not knowing what sustainability means. But if that's imposed on us and we don't even as a sector know how many buildings there are, is that a major problem for us? Because it feels like quite a large concern.
Indeed, I mean, we're investing across Europe, including the UK, for our Singaporean listed REIT. It's called Cromwell European REIT, and having seen the sector and being an owner in the sector, a large scale owner in the sector, it is increasing its weighting across logistics and light industrial throughout those markets. And one of those key questions is obviously take up demand, competition, and so we use the data sets that are currently available and then try and add extra data that we have from local teams on the grounds and complement them. I mean, that's absolutely key. And then going back to your second point about how will it develop going forward, I think it's come through something like a taxonomy. Suddenly, if the government will have an extra desire, or governments will have extra desire because there will be other revenues that are coming through, then it will have extra focus on creating some of the data that Kevin is alluding to that doesn't yet exist. I think that's the only other thing I could think of as well, which may come through, is from an occupier point of view or a user point of view, touching upon some of the things that Phil and Tim have said with those 3PLs and so on, is blockchain, and people being able to map movements of goods, and therefore you will know where they are and if they're stored in a period in a building, as opposed to traveling around. So we've undertaken some research ourselves, Cromwell in-house research team, and one of the anecdotal kind of stories there is traveling of just some goods from Mombasa down in Kenya to the Netherlands. It had to go through 30 and get approval from 30 different organizations, and there are 200 separate communications involved in that. I mean, in each time you have to have the right paperwork, you have to have the right information available. That is particularly cumbersome. So with blockchain, and I think other similar things coming through, if you can increase that efficiency and transparency, it will reduce cost, which is ultimately, and make it more affordable, ultimately the goal for many organizations, but it will also provide us with additional data sets. And I think there will certainly be a desire or a recognition that the more data you have, the more value something has.
So, Matthew, you may have just answered this, but just to close off this conversation, this panel session, I just want to go around to each panelist and just ask if there's one thing that you think needs to happen from a market point of view, industrial logistics, to move forward in this space. What would that be? And maybe you just answered it.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about the last of this session. It's increasing collaboration of data so you can make informed decisions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Tim, maybe I could come to you with the same question. One thing that you'd like to see.
Yes, I agree. Matthew's just said there. I think picking up Phil's point, we've got to be working off the same basis. What is net zero carbon? What is the basis that we're working from? Are we assessing it on the same criteria? So we are comparing like with like. And by the sound of it, at the moment, we're not going to be. And you said, Dan, about COP21 talking about it. We're still talking now. Well, surely in that time, all those great brains could have come up with, a standardized way, or a way that everybody is working off the raw data against a pre-agreed criteria that everybody is measured against.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Tim. Phil, maybe I could come to you with the same question.
Another sort of takeaway from COP26, and this was from Al Gore. The technology exists to make a difference. It's how do we harness that technology? The government's got a consultation out at the moment for the future of freight. They'll be reporting later next year on that. And it's about let's be ambitious and use the technology that's available to actually scale it and make a difference.
That's great. Thank you, Phil. And Kevin.
I'd just go back to the point I made about, if we knew where every single warehouse was, how big it was, who the tenant was, and how old that warehouse was, and that was a public sector maintained database, that would make a lot of difference across Europe. That's a public sector innovation that's needed.
Fantastic. And there are a couple of questions which we've skirted around a little bit, but they're both talking about sort of the mandation from governments or centralized side of things. So thank you very much indeed for the panel, and thank you for everyone for joining. We're going to have a 10-minute break now, and then we'll be back with a second panel session digging a bit more into the technology side of things. So for now, Matthew, Tim, Kevin, and Phil, thank you very much for your time. And to everyone watching, I look forward to seeing you in about 10 minutes' time. Hello, welcome back to the second session that we've got in the industrial and logistics talk. So I'm going to be joined by a fantastic second panel. So if I can invite them to turn their cameras on and join me on the virtual stage. I'm delighted to welcome Gareth Sumner from Transport for London, Robert Hakelar from Prologis, Will Young from Navigator CRE, Lois Barton from Mendoza, and Patricia Latore from Humanizing Autonomy. Thank you all for joining me. Robert, perhaps I could start with you. Good morning. Could you just say a few words about you and your role in your company?
Yeah, hi. I am Robert Hakelar. I work at Prologis. So we're the largest global real estate owner of, call it logistic warehouses. We have in about 5,000 of them, let's say 140 billion assets under management. And my role is more on the innovation side. Officially, I'm an IT person, but my role is VP Architecture and Emerging Technologies. And I kind of focus a little bit more on the emerging technology side, being responsible for innovation in Europe and work in a global team where we have established what we call Prologis Labs. So we have an own space in the States where we can do all kinds of experiments. We take all kinds of technology in, we make them, we break them, and we try to discover whether it can be of value for Prologis in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. Patricia, good morning. Can I come to you?
Good morning. My name is Patricia Latore. I'm the head of strategic partnerships at Humanizing Autonomy. What we do is we've developed a software that is able to analyze, understand, and predict the behaviors of vulnerable road users. So that includes pedestrians, cyclists, e-scooter users, wheelchair users, and we integrate with camera systems either on vehicles like dash cam or blind spot monitoring cameras, but also infrastructure cameras in facilities, logistics facilities, warehouses. So anywhere you can use understanding of human behavior to improve safety or efficiency of operations.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Patricia. And Lois, good morning. Maybe I could come to you next, please.
Good morning. So thanks for having me today. I'm Lois. I'm the head of CS over at Adozo. We're a single platform for digital mapping and property data. So it's used by the industry to value properties more efficiently. So we've got a whole range of data on the platform, which is displayed in various ways, but it covers all commercial sectors. So there's something on there that's useful for everyone. And my role there is to make sure our customers are happy, they're getting the most out of the platform, and also feeding back into the team things that they would find useful moving forward as well. So we're constantly innovating, we're constantly enhancing our offering to make it as useful as possible for our customer base.
Fantastic. I think a lot of this conversation will focus on data. So thank you very much, Lois. Will, good morning. Same question to you.
Good morning, and thanks for having me. I'm Will Young, the head of UK for Navigator CRE, which is a data integration and visualization platform for commercial real estate for all assets and persona types. So we are agnostic to data source or data type. So we pull in a company's data, integrate it all into one easy to use and easy to access platform for executives all the way down to analysts.
Fantastic. Thank you, Will. And Gareth, good morning.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Gareth Sumner. I'm Commercial Innovation Lead at Transport for London, or TfL. Probably don't need to say too much about TfL. I think most people will know broadly what we do, but we either operate or regulate or manage almost all of the transport in London, and that includes playing a management role on London's roads, where, for example, we control all of the traffic lights in London from our control centre within PlaceTech and Southwark. Within TfL, I'm in the commercial innovation team. I originally joined TfL 10 years ago, but I left TfL for a couple of years to join a startup. I then returned from the startup early this year, and basically my role and my team's role within TfL is to improve the way we work with innovators like startups or big R&D labs and big corporates, to basically enable TfL to innovate more effectively with market innovators rather than just trying to do everything ourselves. So really glad to be here today, and keen to kind of share some of my views.
Brilliant, thank you. I think I'd like to start talking about the impact of the last 24 months. So COVID has clearly had a big impact. And from the previous panel session, we spoke about unprecedented demand, but also problems with supply. So Robert, maybe I can come to you as a starting point as the largest industrial space owner and operator. How have you seen things change over the last couple of years?
So I can definitely second what has been discussed in the previous panel. There's a huge demand, but the supply chain issues are definitely there. During the last 1.5 months, it became actually very clear that resources are extremely valuable as well. You have to have the right people in the warehouses in order to operate. And when demand suddenly increases big time and resources are limited because of regulatory restrictions, people needed to stay at home, people could not work, people got sick, etc., etc. Our customers definitely start to realize even more that automation is the way to go, and make sure that you have technology in place that can at least help resources doing their job. So there was just it went way faster suddenly, the demand for automation, and that means for us, as a landlord, also the requirements for new buildings are changing as well. For example, you need to have a backend infrastructure. You need to have different kind of energy specifications in your warehouse because of all the electrification. So a lot of things are happening as a result of customers wanting to automate more. But definitely the robots, the automated things in the warehouses, like the pick and packing, it's increasing hugely big time. And on the other side, what I also wanted to say is it's also on the resources side is people started to value resources better in that sense. So in that sense, the employee well-being and the perspective on the well-being, of course, very much connected to the whole ESG trend that is happening, is increasing as well. So suddenly people wanted us to start measuring air quality in the warehouse. And, it had to be in a healthy and a safe environment where people have to be working in. And you have to make sure that your warehouse is better to work in than your neighbors.
So Robert, just sticking with that, so picking air quality as an example, because I'm sure there are lots of different things that you're asked to. How do you go about measuring air quality within a building? And also, how do you go about retrofitting that to 5,000, I think you said 5,000 buildings that you've got that are already around the world? Yeah,
so that's a really good question. So the retrofitting part, it will not go that fast. It is a handshake between the customer and ourselves in that sense. But if we start with new developments, then it's definitely We have now already a few buildings well-being certified. So that's the Wellbeing Institute, comes from New York. Normally was very office-oriented. We transformed that in about 2 years ago to the logistics side, and so we set the standards to actually start becoming more well-being, more employee well-being oriented. And we just put in all kinds of sensors in the warehouse to start monitoring the air qualities. And we just follow the benchmarks that are offered by the well-being certification.
That's brilliant, Robert. Thank you. Gareth, maybe I can come to you. The last 24 months has seen some pretty dramatic changes from a transport point of view in cities generally. What have you seen changing from a transport point of view, and how you think that's changed things going forward?
Well, I think there's been lots of changes that everyone has seen in our cities. There's been a move away from public transport for a period of time, but we've also seen how important public transport has been for essential workers, particularly, for example, the buses, which although there was a big drop in bus usage over the last 18 months, there was always a lot of people who were still using the buses, nurses, shift workers, key workers, supermarkets, etc. So I think kind of in a way we've seen a big change in the way people travel, but we've also seen how important the public transport system is just to kind of keeping London operating and keeping the kind of lights on in a kind of very unique period for us. And we've also seen increase in the use of private car, and we've also seen increases in the use of delivery vehicles, because shopping habits have clearly kind of changed quite a lot over the last kind of 10 years. We've seen a move towards online shopping and more delivery to people's homes, and that was accelerated clearly during the pandemic. Now, there are lots of advantages to that in terms of people have started to really appreciate the convenience of being able to shop from home and have things delivered to their door, but it's also got negative implications as well, and we have to try and manage that. We have to find a way to mitigate the impact of the congestion that it can cause, mitigate the impact of the pollution, both from the tailpipe but also from particulate emissions. And we have to find a way to mitigate things like any impact on safety as well. And I think that's really kind of one of our key challenges now in terms of trying to understand how we can take the positives of the changes that have happened during the pandemic, but also mitigate the negative impacts.
That's great. And how do you go about understanding how many vehicles there are on a road, and whether it's a private car or a delivery vehicle, and how many people within the building, the vehicle? So within a bus or a train, could be empty or full. How do you go about collecting that data to understand and inform those decisions?
Well, it's something that is not new to TfL. We've been trying to estimate how many people have been travelling on our transport network for a long time, and there's many different ways that we have done that in the past. There's been the very kind of rudimental way of doing it in terms of issuing forms. I don't know if any, I'm sure some people in the audience will have received a form on a bus where they've been asked to kind of fill in various details. And that was for a very long time what TfL used to do to understand who was traveling. Things have clearly changed now. We now have a lot of data from, for example, the contactless payment systems and the Oyster card systems we have on gate lines and on buses. But we're also experimenting with different technology, for example, using cameras on buses to understand how busy they are, which seats are taken, which seats aren't taken, to understand how busy they are now, but also predict how busy they will be at different times in the future. And we've also then got a really wide-reaching CCTV system on our roads as well. So we're able to understand which roads are the busiest, which ones are less busy, and how that's changing over time.
That's great. Patricia, maybe I could come to you on that. Obviously, image recognition, there are cameras everywhere on everything now. So what have you seen change in the last couple of years, and have you seen demand going up specifically? And what's possible from a sort of transport point of view, identifying both people and the vehicles?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, it also depends a little bit on what countries you're looking at. So, for example, in the UK and especially in London, CCTV cameras are everywhere. If you're going to talk to a German city, it's a very different approach and still get asked very different questions. But in general, so even markets like Germany, which are maybe a little bit more hesitant, camera usage is increasing. I think both public and private sectors understanding that it's going to be used as a data source. It can be done ethically. It can be done safe. So GDPR, everyone has agreed, is kind of the lowest minimum standard. Companies can go above and beyond that in terms of data privacy, and that's something that we take quite serious and then spend a lot of time on educating, because also, you know, clients will use it as an excuse. It's a buzzword that they throw out as a hurdle without really understanding what the policies are about. But so in terms of also kind of, you know, patterns and trends, of course, during the lockdowns, not many people moving around, but actually there were people moving. We were just moving very differently around cities. Anyone that took the chance of going around London when there were no cars, you know, you could walk in the middle of the street and all of a sudden became a very different landscape. And so noticing those changes in behaviors, noticing and seeing the uptake of cycling. So now that we're on vehicles, we can look at and still count the number of cyclists, and not just count, but understand where are they actually cycling? Are they causing delays to a bus network because of the new cycle lanes and buses being stuck, or around construction zones, the dangerous overtaking of cyclists? So all these things we can understand, and then, you know, start to think about what's the city of tomorrow like for all of us, and how do we improve the safety and also the well-being that we all feel. So lots of different insights that I could go on and on about.
That's fantastic. Just one very quick question. Is this something that needs to be built in from the start, or can this be retrofitted to existing cameras and feeds?
It can be retrofit. So any camera source, and anything that a dash cam that you put into your vehicle, if you use your cell phone on Google Maps and turn on the video at the same time. So any camera will do.
Fantastic. Will, maybe I could come to you. How have you seen the use of your software and your data being changed over the last couple of years in the industrial and logistics market?
Yeah, I think the changes to the market have, you know, increased capital looking at the industrial and logistics space. So it's required executives and teams to move faster. And to be able to move faster, you have to be enabled by data. And we've seen a lot of customers have large swaths of data, whether they generate it or they are subscribed to it, but they can't really use it because it's either not clean, it's not accessible, or it's not integrated. And so with our platform, the first steps are to integrate and make data actionable. From there, you can generate insights because you have all of your data at your fingertips. And in this dynamic industry and market, especially coming off of COVID, we are helping customers to make more informed decisions quicker.
Thank you, Will. And Lois, maybe I can come to you on the same question. What have you seen in terms of people using your software, your insights, and your platform over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I think for us, we've noticed kind of two main areas. So very similar to Will, you know, the market has grown exponentially, whereas a few years ago, growth was maybe a bit more sedate. So you could use some older information and it still be valuable. Whereas now you need to up-to-date real-time information at your fingertips, which is where the data and technology comes in, because you can log on, you know, I know for us, we load hundreds of deals over the course of days, weeks and whatnot. So we know for our customers, the data is there as and when they need it, and it's up to date. So I think that's really useful in terms of the market. And then there's the more practical and human side. So people that maybe were a bit resistant to change, a bit resistant to getting involved with data and technology, the COVID situation forced their hand because the traditional methods that they used just weren't available to them. So, you know, they came to us, we sat quite close to them, we got people comfortable with something that they didn't think would be particularly, I think they always knew it would be useful, but it was, you know, always someone else's job to do. Whereas wider mix of people using the platform and you know, asking us questions, giving us feedback, putting their data on, and using it day to day and finding it useful.
That's great. Lois, maybe I could stick with you on something you picked up there, which is about people now being in the position where they were more likely to try things, often because they've been forced to. For a lot of real estate companies, it's very difficult for them to just test and try stuff out. So how have you seen that change, and what would you recommend people to do if they do want to try out things?
Yeah, I say, you know, sometimes people are a bit put off by technology companies, but we're all run by humans. We're all, you know, very personal, very friendly. And I always say just get in contact and ask for a free trial. You know, if you have confidence in your proposition and your product, I don't think any brand should turn around and say, oh, no, we're not going to show it you. Or, you know, we encourage people to come to us, share some of their data, we'll onboard it, we'll show them how it's going to look. We'll talk them through our roadmap. So they have the opportunity to test the waters and make sure that it's going to be suitable for them before they make that commitment. I think the other side of it as well is, you know, a lot of these systems and technologies are more affordable than what they used to be. I mean, one of our main things is this technology should be available to everyone. So, you know, you have different price points for, you know, for different types of memberships, that type of thing. But I think, you know, just pick up the phone, have conversations with people, get them to show you their platform, get yourself a login for 7 days, and just see what it can do for you.
Fantastic. Have a play. Patricia, same question to you. How do you see people trying stuff out and testing it, and how can they go about doing that? And then Robert, I'll come to you perhaps for your view on that.
Yeah, to echo what's been said, it's really interesting. There's more demand than ever for data, and that real time, I want to know now, which can be challenging. In our experience, it also really depends when you're talking to a B2B kind of use case, who within the organization is wanting the data and what they're wanting the data for. And so while there's more demand, at the same time, for example, you have drivers who might be more wary of increased, you know, data usage because it could highlight things that they're doing wrong. And so it goes back to what are you using the data for internally, externally. And so, yeah, more demand, but really more use cases to be discussed.
That's great. Robert?
So what I wanted to say is it is very difficult for real estate organizations to actually determine what to choose and which data company is the best one to go, which software to pick, etc. And what I see is that a lot of companies have difficulties with the selection part. So people experiment not that much in that sense. When they start to talk to a company, they probably right away think that they have to stick with that company and go into like this huge process for a year or so, and then suddenly after a long time they determine that it's not the way to go. I think what people should do more is just pick a solution, experiment with it, as what Luis said as well, like for a few days or for a few weeks or maybe a month or so, and determine which use case can be solved with that, and then move on. Don't get like married with the first company that you encounter.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And Robert, how do you do this at Prologis? Is this something that you scatter and you let everyone try stuff out, or do you have that in? I think you mentioned the innovation lab that you've got. Do you test it in that?
So I can give you the right political answer, and I can give you the true answer. And the true answer is, you know, it's very difficult to actually not have people in the regions test things out as well. Yeah, you have like what I always call like the OT, so operational technology, and the IT. And with the whole data trend, things are actually now coming together. So we definitely sometimes see somewhere in the region a solution that pops up, and then suddenly we have to start integrating it or have to start having a discussion whether it's acceptable or not. The best thing, and what we're trying to do, is move things into our Prologis labs, where we have this protected environment where we can do all kinds of experiments with the people that actually come up with the idea. And we even do experiments with our customers, because sometimes our customers don't have the space or the bandwidth to do an experiment themselves. For example, a drone scanning, or, you know, other fun stuff. Then we'll bring them into our lab and we'll do the experiment together, because we'd like to learn from that as well. You know, we'd like to use that knowledge in discussions with our customers in the future as well. So for us, it's then a win-win.
That's great. And Gareth, maybe I could come to you. How do TfL go about testing some of this out? Because you're well known of using lots of technology and being advanced in this space, but it's also very hard for you to test something out and then not use it or or for something to go wrong. So how do you go about it within TfL?
Sure. Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that the team that I'm in, the commercial innovation team, is all about trying to crack that problem. We're relatively new within TfL. We formed the team 3 or 4 years ago. And the whole point was because it can be difficult for public sector organisations to experiment and to work with innovators in the market. And that's mainly because of public sector procurement rules, but it's also because as a large organisation, it's very easy to kind of get stuck in your ways. So although we have been very innovative in the past, and we are, we believe, and we're constantly reminded that we are seen as an innovator in the transport industry, kind of internationally, but we can't just kind of like sit in our laurels and just kind of like keep on moving in the same direction. So what we are trying to do in the commercial innovation team is explore how we can work with the market more effectively and experiment and trial. The kind of things we do to achieve that is we run innovation challenges. So an example of that is Freight Lab, where we put challenges out to the market to essentially asking innovators to show how they could reduce the impact of freight and deliveries on London. And Patricia's company, Humanising Autonomy, was one of the successful innovators on that scheme. We're currently working with Humanising Autonomy to trial their technology. I think the key thing is we always have to be very careful about how we set these things up. What we don't want to do is trial things in a way that then prevent us from scaling the technology if it is seen as successful. We need to think about how we can then kind of move the trials and technologies through the various phases. So eventually we can see an impact across TfL, across London, and hopefully also share that expertise and that experience with the rest of the UK and even the world. So it's got to be a very structured process for us. We haven't always been the best at it, but we're hopefully getting better, and we're very kind of keen to hear feedback on how we can work more effectively with innovators in the market to get that process right.
Brilliant. Well, maybe I could come to you with a very slightly different question. I suppose what's happened and changed, and how do people go about trying it? But we've heard a lot about data, and in your introduction, you were talking about data, and people are really trying to clamber over themselves to get some data at the moment, which is great. But it's very often not clean, not accessible, and you listed some other things. So how have you seen that changing, and how do you recommend people get started with this data journey that people are going?
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert and Lois alluded to it, and I think everyone's kind of touched on it a little bit. You have to understand what type of solution you're looking for, because in remote work environments, in teams that are kind of spread out across countries and regions, it's important to have buy-in from those teams to really vet out a technology solution and ensure that you are understanding the value proposition. So sometimes it's as short as a week getting access to a data platform. Other times it can be a 3-month trial period. We've moved into, at Navigator, a situation where there is a 3-month pilot with an opt-out afterwards tied into the contract. So lower pricing and an opt-out with your money back to ensure that teams can get buy-in, but it also allows the teams to get engaged with the platform and get engaged with an enterprise solution that sits across all of their data solutions. So if it's a point solution, you can generally understand much quicker what teams need it and get that message out. But on a broader scale, if you're rolling something out, it takes a little more time. And it takes some time for people to adjust their patterns and the way they interact with their data. So that's how we've seen it be successful in getting engagement from teams. But as everyone has alluded to, there are a variety of ways to make sure you're vetting out technology solutions appropriately.
Okay, great. And just as a journey from a data point of view specifically, the panel that we were talking about earlier spoke about a lot of the existing data sets that are used, whether that's size, rent, yield, and so on. But we're looking much more about the people impact, the electricity, the connectivity, all of these other things which need data, some of which are collected by individual organizations, some come from outside, and some from a mixture of the two. Will, how are you finding people on that maturity journey at understanding what they need, and where are we as a generally?
It really is a journey. And I think we're in the early stages of understanding how data can impact decision-making across organizations. what we're seeing across our customer base is that the use cases are varying based on what people are focused on. Some right now are focused on capital projects, suite upgrades, build outs, work order efficiency, those types of things, but a lot more are focused on ESG data, access control. Where are people entering the building? How long are they staying in the building? Where are they spending their time in the building? Where are fleets headed? And tying that into broader ESG data, energy usage. Robert mentioned air quality control measurement earlier. Being able to tie all those disparate data sets together to get a clear picture of what's happening is really what we're heading towards, and is going to help people make more informed decisions at an asset level and at a portfolio level.
Okay, so Robert, maybe I could come to you on ESG data generally. Are we doing okay as a sector on collecting that? Because that's different types of data from what we've used in the past. And also, you do have a huge portfolio, so you can benchmark. But for the market generally, it's very difficult to benchmark if you only have one or two data sets. So how do we go about that?
No, to answer your question, I don't think we're pretty far with that getting the ESG data. I think every real estate organization currently is struggling to get the right data out of their buildings. So take a very simple example. In the short future, you have to determine what is the landlord use and what is the customer use in your warehouse. That means that you have to start measuring the panels in your warehouse, and you have to know, what the panel is actually driving. So we're not that far yet. We're doing a lot of smart metering, but not on the circuit level that is probably desired in the future. From a general data perspective, what I see is you have to have a vision in order to start collecting the data. And that is the same with the ESG data. You have to have this broader vision of, okay, this is where I'm going to make sure that the data is landing. This is how I can extract all the data points from all the different vendors that I'm working with. Or as from now, my policy will be that all the data should land first in my data lake, and then we can share it with other vendors. You have to have that perspective straight in order to start doing something with the data, because you have to have a lake where it lands so that you can do the right analytics with it. Then you move into to the whole sustainability side. Then you suddenly have your meter information, your air quality information, your BMS information, etc., at one place, and then you can start to do some smart things. But I don't think the sector is that far with that yet. You're on mute then.
Happens to someone, so best it happens to me. So we're early on this journey. You were talking about all of this data going into a data lake. How do you go about sharing that with the wider industry? Because if you really want to understand what's going on, you were talking about sharing with vendors, the benchmarking. People talk about sharing a lot, but very often it's their commercial, or it's seen as their commercial advantage, and so they don't want to. So how do we get the industry to move forward and to protect that commercial advantage, but to share at the same time?
This is like a running question for the last years, and I think it's a very fun question. I'm a big fan of blockchain as well, which the last panel ended talking about blockchain. That is probably the best way to start sharing data. But first of all, we need to have the real estate organization be willing to share data. And at this moment, data is in that sense power. And people are reluctant to give away that power, or they have this feeling that they're giving away their power if they're sharing the data. Maybe the ESG side will be a driver to start sharing more data. I actually hope so, and maybe we can do it on the blockchain so that it's the data ownership will actually stay with the company. But it's a challenge then.
Yeah, absolutely. Lois, maybe I could come to you, because I know a lot of the data sets you deal with is about aggregating existing public data sets and providing them to valuers or developers. How do we go about changing the sharing culture so people access more data and also share their data as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think it's a change of. I think this is I'm probably using the wrong terminology here, but it's a change of a habit. You know, people have always shared data, just not necessarily using technology. People have always picked up the phone and said, "Oh, you did a deal here," and this. So it's been done before, but I think there's this blocker with people that, oh, if it's on a platform, there's something different about it when there isn't. So I think it's changing the views on that, and also helping people to understand that the more data you have at your fingertips, the more you know, the more knowledge you have, the more efficient you'll be. So I think it's just a journey people have got to go on, and then I think eventually, I don't think there's any kind of magic key that will give us the answer or unlock the door. I think it's just a change in behaviour. It's going to come.
A lot of this is coming down to culture rather than the actual technology itself, isn't it? But Patricia, maybe I could come to you. So there are definitely people who are very loath to share data for a variety of different reasons. It's their commercial advantage or privacy. The insight that you can get from cameras seems extraordinary, but there are also some confidentiality risks, and you mentioned GDPR and going beyond. I just wanted to get your view on how do you go about protecting that in an ethical way, and how do we persuade people to share data, but where it's appropriate?
So two answers to the question. One is the ethical part. So and especially when you're dealing with AI or machine learning, all these buzzwords that people are throwing around. I always say to businesses that are looking to use any data analytics platforms to make sure that they understand the AI that they're going to be buying. So that's ethical and explainable AI. So our models are built in a way that, because we also do, for example, real-time alerts to drivers on blind spot detection, we can look at the code and we can understand why the software made a decision it made. And then that can be relayed to drivers or also facilities anytime anyone's looking at this, because people only use the technology if they understand it and trust it. So that's a huge link. And so a lot of this has to go back to education. On the kind of data sharing side and how to incentivize, it's quite interesting because I also, and then going back to one of the previous questions you had, people think they know what they want out of the data. They're really biased when they start talking about this. They think they know what they want and what they were going to see. 99.9% of the time, we show them something completely different that they had no idea about. And I always urge people to be open-minded when they're looking at data, and then, start with one data source, see what you're looking at, understand it, and then you can start adding. So going back to this data lake, that's great. Start small and then expand, because otherwise it's going to be overwhelming. You're going to lose track of what you actually initially wanted to do. And so that's always a fun part of the journey with the client and customer.
That's great, thank you. And Gareth, maybe I could come to you. TfL has huge amounts of data, and you make a lot of that accessible, but there's clearly a lot of stuff that is confidential or personal data. How do you go about deciding and managing what data to share and what not to, and how do people go about accessing it?
Well, I guess the first thing is understanding what the kind of bare minimum are. So it's kind of starting with things like GDPR, but then building on that and understanding more about actually what the public believe we should be doing with data. So understanding the kind of public perception, public feeling about what we can and can't do. Because it doesn't matter if it's written down in the rule or not. If we do something which is seen as not essential to the public, we're doing the wrong thing based on our objectives. And I think the next thing is thinking about, well, what are biggest priorities? And for example, one of our biggest priorities has always been and is always going to be safety. So understanding how we can use data to improve safety on the roads. So we've signed up to the Vision Zero vision to reduce all road deaths to zero and all serious injuries. And we're constantly looking at different ways that we can use data that we already have, but also data that we can source from elsewhere to better understand, for example, places in London where the safety is not what it should be, understand if behaviour of drivers or cyclists or pedestrians is affecting that, and understand what we can do to mitigate those kind of black spots that we've spotted. And I think There are other uses of data, but we always have to kind of think about, well, what is the core objective, and kind of think about the kind of priorities. And I think in terms of which data sources we select and who we work with, it's and also kind of what is the kind of transaction there in terms of kind of who is getting the benefit, and whether we pay for data, whether we share data freely, or whether we even kind of charge people to access data. It's always thinking about where the benefit is for both sides, and not just seeing it as kind of a one-sided transaction. And we're trying to be open-minded with that. We haven't necessarily got it right so far, but we're trying to constantly kind of experiment, talk to the market, talk to different data providers to understand what is the best approach going forward.
That's great. And I suppose that touches on Patricia's point earlier of knowing what you want to get out of it rather than sort of predicting. Robert, maybe I could come to you with a slightly different question. So sustainability, and we've touched on it here, the ESG agenda is really going up. I just wondered what you were doing at Prologis in terms of testing out technologies for the short and long term about the environmental impact that buildings could have.
So most of these efforts are with new developments. That is actually the most easy. A retrofit is always more difficult. We definitely do things with retrofits though. What we're trying to do with our new developments is we test out every aspect. Actually, we test out the skeleton that you build of the building. We're doing that with sometimes we even with circular goods. So we have 1.5 years ago, we've built a building where a lot of the goods that we brought in were reused. Glass sectors came actually from an old dentist company. So we're trying to actually reuse a lot of things. So that's really good from a sustainability perspective. But on the other side, we're also experimenting with new floors, like thinner floors, so that you can actually, it costs a lot of CO to actually create these cement floors. So if you have a thinner floor, which is, it's the backbone of the warehouse, right? So it has to carry a lot of weight. So you have to make sure that that is safe. Well, we're experimenting with that to make that most sustainable. And for the rest, it is all about insulation. It is all about solar panels. We're now in Tilburg, one of the buildings in the Netherlands. We start to experiment with a 1 megawatt battery to facilitate truck charging, but also to store the solar energy that we get from the roofs and use that at the right time. So also a little bit of peak shaving over there. So there are so many sustainability things going on currently.
And is that one of the main priorities that you've got in terms of the focus of technology to make it more sustainable?
Yes, it is. It is from our company's perspective, it is, but also from our customers' perspective. It is exactly the same. Our customers are demanding carbon neutral buildings, or sometimes even, carbon positive buildings. If you put a lot of solar panels on the roof, you can actually make it carbon positive. But also our customers are demanding for a good, very huge grid connection because they all anticipate on the fact that they have to change their fleet into an electric fleet. So a lot of things that we also, from a sustainability perspective, have to do for our customers.
That's great. Well, maybe I could come to you. Are you seeing sustainability go up the agenda and the use of data for that from your customers and clients?
We are. And so everything Robert just touched on are really hot button issues right now, as they should be. But where you start to get more and more value is seeing that combined with the financial and other operational data. How are these changes, how are these experiments affecting my ability to sign up customers, my ability to deliver on promises, and then reporting that back to either customers or boards or advisors and helping you understand what the real outcome and what the real impact of those changes are. That's where you start to hit that inflection point and get later on the journey of accessing data to to drive real insights that can be applied across your portfolio, across regions, and across asset types.
And that's great. So sustainability for the impact on the environment, but also being able to see the financial and the long-term business impact as well. Is that right? And Lois, what about you? Are people using your data sets and your platform to understand more about that they're working in and the impact that they have on the environment?
Yeah, definitely. And we're doing all we can to try and support that. So give them as much information as we can get for them. So we're looking to incorporate EPC information onto the site relatively soon, so they've got that in at their fingertips when they need it. You know, we were discussing this topic with the Valves Director Alison Young recently, and you know, it's something that we all need to take on board and you know try and provide to our customers, because you know, he's very confident that energy performance is going to have an impact on market value, you know, over the next few years. It's going to become a big thing about how much an asset is worth. So the more information that we can give people on that, the better. And it's definitely something that we're supporting them with.
That's fantastic. So Patricia, maybe I could come to you. The environment itself is going up the agenda and the impact on the environment that buildings have, but also the people within buildings are becoming much more important about how the building works for them. And we heard from Robert earlier about air quality and well-being. How are you seeing people use technology for both the environment and also people and operating in buildings?
Yeah, so that's a really kind of important angle that we take, is that, you know, sustainability is hugely important, and so is safety. And we shouldn't really be talking about them separately. It is an opportunity to kind of change the discourse in the industry and kind of, rethink things. So addressing them together. And it can be as simple as understanding, you know, by understanding where you have things like machinery having to stop, machinery because you have people walking, things like around lunchtime, you know, people behaviors change. You take the quickest path to the lunchroom. And so how does that impact and slow down your operations, and how are you wasting time? Also the use of space. So do you really need the giant warehouse facility, or by better optimizing the flow of the goods, of movement of people, can you decrease your space this way? Can you then reutilize space in your warehouse and logistics facilities in other ways? So that's the insights that we can provide. And then it's also about, you know, linking that with kind of your company goals. So this is exactly what I was talking about. When someone approaches us and says, we want to, you know, decrease downtime of our AGVs by 25%. That's great, but are you also thinking about the further impact that that's going to have across your network? What are you going to do with that time? Because all of a sudden you have more goods going around, and then how's that changing the behavior of the people? So it's really that cycle that it starts. And so that's an opportunity then to link both the safety and the sustainability.
That's great. And Robert, maybe I could come to you with a slightly different question. So probably more than any other sector, the industrial sector is dictated to and informed by and influences transport, logistics, and that side of things are inextricably linked. How do you think the role of government and industry bodies to address some of the things that we've spoken about? So standardization, the type of measuring things impact of buildings, about involving themselves in that, and are they doing enough?
Are they doing enough? It's that's difficult. I think they're trying hard enough, at least. So I think it's hugely important, but it's not only the responsibility of them, right? It is also a responsibility of the real estate sector itself. So I think if you want to move forward in this fast-growing sector, and if you don't want to get stuck within X amount of years, then you have to open up the discussion and start to share visions and start to share as a sector where we believe we need to go, and have this open-minded discussion with them about how they see currently the impact of you know, our sector on all the things that they're seeing. You know, one bigger discussion, which is already a few years, is obviously the fact that you don't want to have all these little vans racing through your street all the time, and you have like 10 per minute racing around. You know, can't that be more efficient? I know that there are a lot of discussions in London with the local government over there to start, seeing how can this be made more efficient? What kind of solutions are out there, etc. I think it's hugely important to have those people involved in these discussions. And think of, a few years further, start in a later stage, we might start to fly drones through the city. How can we do that? How can we actually avoid that becoming like one big mess? Where should the drone highways be? Where should the drones be able to land and not? So these are all things that you have to discuss with the local people that will grant whether it's possible or not.
That's great. So I'm conscious of time, but Gareth, I have to. How on earth does an organisation that's focused on making sure a really established and fixed old-fashioned city can also accommodate the drones in the next decades?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I think the kind of biggest thing is just that we need to make sure there are people within organisations like TfL who have an open mind and who are able to engage with the market and engage with people who are thinking about the future, engage with regulators like the CAA, for example, on the drones question. But we also need to kind of really keep a focus on what are our objectives as TfL and what is in the interests of the kind of the population of London overall. We need to make sure that when we are exploring new technologies, whether it's drones, whether it's flying taxis, whether it's autonomous vehicles, that we understand what the benefits are for individuals, both individually and also strategically. There is a place for new technologies and to trial new technologies, but we've got to work out where that place is. It isn't always London. Sometimes it is London, but often it's that we will keep an eye on what's happening elsewhere. So, and I think delivery drones is a great example that there's got a lot of potential for delivery drones, but probably they should be trialed and tested in much lower density places. And then we should look to learn however we can by engaging with other transport authorities, other local authorities, to understand what the impacts are and understand what the benefits are.
Fantastic. That has been a brilliant conversation, and thank you to all of you. I'm just going to wrap by asking you one thing. If there are people listening to this who want to engage with technology, what is the one thing that you would recommend that they do? And Gareth, maybe I can stay with you as you're on the screen at the moment. Then, what is the one thing you would recommend people?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think kind of overall is kind of stay engaged in the debate, but kind of more selfishly from our point of view, like we want to hear from you, but particularly we want to hear from you when there's a benefit in solving one of the challenges that we've got as TfL. So I think that the single thing that I'd like anyone to do who has got an innovation is sign up to our innovators database. So you can go to our website, just Google commercial innovation at TfL, and there's a database you can sign up to, which means you'll hear about any of the challenges we're trying to solve through innovation in the future.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Gareth. Will, maybe I could come to you next.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing would be for organizations to focus on what they're best at. So if you're a great operator of industrial and logistics, commercial real estate, trying to be a technology company could be an expensive distraction. And so utilizing the best in class for these types of solutions and the best providers to help you gain value from your data and your portfolio is going to be what best serves the organization.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Will. Lois, same question to you. One thing you'd recommend people to do?
So I'd say really decide and be clear on exactly what to get from data and technology, and then come speak to us at Adozo. See if we can help you. No, but really understand what it is you're trying to get out of that data and technology, because then I think that will give you a clearer path moving forward.
Perfect. That was two, I think, but that's perfect. Thank you. Patricia, same to you.
Yeah, kind of related to that but also answer those LinkedIn messages, not just for myself, but technologies or people you wouldn't normally talk to. Kind of open your horizons, understand what's out there, because that's going to help you understand what you don't want, which will help you understand what you do want to do with the data. So that's my point.
Brilliant. Thank you. Lovely to you.
Yeah, no, a lot of things that I totally agree with. One other thing is, if you want to start with using data, determine what data is for you and start to experiment small.
Perfect. So some really good advice there to end up with. Thank you very much to all of the panelists for joining today. Thank you very much to the sponsor Malcolm for this session as well. So thank you very much indeed for joining.